The hopeful envoy was launched on August 10th, 2256 from the Titan Orbital Assembly Yard, marking the 20th and final Sojourner-class logistics support vessel built by the FDR. She was mainly tasked with transporting materials for the early stage colonies commanded by Captain Matthias Pearson. The Sojourner's successor, the Border class, was still in development at the time, and the hopeful envoy was used as a testbed for many of its systems. Due to that, it was known for its unreliability, yet it still saw many years of service under the command of Captain Pearson and a rather diverse crew. That was until February 29th, 2276, where it was delivering urgently needed raw materials to the planet HR7703A. From its current location, that was a 40 light-year jump, the usual limit being 25 for its class. The FDR had no other ships available at the time, and the hopeful envoy was technically capable thanks to the Border-class jump drive. The distance restrictions were lifted, and the drive was recalibrated for 40 light-years. The go-ahead was given, and they jumped. There was just one issue. A problem with the long-distance jump drives was discovered in testing for the Border-class jump drive and fixed before it went into production. But the hopeful envoy had a prototype drive, one that never received the fix. Normally not an issue since it only cropped up in jumps exceeding 35 light-years, but the FDR shipwrights had never fully tested the extent of the issue, and as far as the crew were aware, a jump of 40 light-years would only result in mild damage. That was unfortunately not the case. From the crew's perspective, the ship lurched forward for 3 seconds before an explosion from the jump drive bay threw them around. All 7,000 of them didn't know what happened, where they were, or what was going on, but they were well trained and jumped straight into action. They appeared to have been dropped off into a close orbit of a red dwarf star, their ship heavily damaged. It was a very eventful next 2 hours, officers racing around trying to see what was happening and give orders, while the enlisted raced around trying to fulfill those orders. But the fires were put out, the holes in the hull were plugged, and they finally had some time to figure out their next move. Firstly, the damage. The jump drive and the FTL relay were both utterly destroyed, taking out much of the equipment in the surrounding bays. Luckily, the fusion power core and fusion torch engines, while damaged, were repairable. This meant they were safe for now and could move about the star system without much issue. But that brought up the second point, where they were. After a few hours of observations and cross-referencing star maps, they were determined to be in the new outer arm of the Milky Way, roughly 30,000 light-years from Terra. There was effectively no possibility of FDR knowing where they went, and even if their jump drive was in working order, still would have been about 20 years worth of jumps to get home. So they were stuck, which brought them to point 3, what to do now? The red dwarf they had orbited had a few smaller planets, but nothing that they could make survivable. Luckily, it was part of a binary star system with the largest star about 100 AU out. It would mean about a month-long trip and had no guarantee of success, but it was their best bet at finding a more habitable planet. With the ship on its way, they discovered that the third planet was within the habitable zone of the star. While it was slightly larger with a gravity of 1.2 Gs, it still had an atmosphere that wasn't too thick, had significant oxygen, and a sufficiently protective magnetic field. Upon arrival, they began with high-quality surface scans. Life did exist on the planet, and to a frightening degree. The higher gravity ensured nothing reached the same colossal scales as the largest dinosaurs of Earth, but the extremely oxygen-rich and warm climate allowed for mainly insect-like creatures to flourish in huge numbers. Wildly diverse DNA so dissimilar amongst various creatures that it'd make humans and bananas look like close relatives. Life on the New World, which they named Ranska, started out hard, but relatively simple. Gather resources, clear forests, construct buildings, plant seeds. The buildings were basic and communal, with B-level tech being used wherever possible. After a few years, enough infrastructure was in place to allow the colonists to have children more frequently. Another few years passed and enough of the mining infrastructure was in place that the hopeful envoy dropships were no longer necessary, which was good, because many of their parts could be manufactured, and they were deemed inoperable shortly after. 7 years in, things were still difficult, but manageable. The population had grown with over 1,600 children being born since arrival. Unfortunately, there was a schism amongst the colonists, with 1,200 of them ultimately leaving to form their own colony and cutting contact. Their numbers were small, and even with the D-tier fabricators they kept, they just didn't have the people necessary to survive long term. The numbers failed to grow and eventually dwindled between the food shortages and being picked off with the wildlife. This was very unfortunate, and the leaders of the main colony wished not to repeat it. So a rule was put in place for those wishing to start their own colony. It was fairly simple. A group of colonists could vote to leave, and leave as long as neither them nor the colony they were leaving had a population of less than 5,000. That was deemed the minimum population necessary for self-sufficiency. It had now been 35 years, and some new colonies had already been formed thanks to their ability to continue using advanced tech to automate and allow more time to raise children. Their global population managed to reach 40,000 people, but it was becoming obvious that they were losing their advanced tech, since without high-tier fabricators, they only had the population to support the supply chain for B-tier tech. So they recorded as much of the plans as possible on B-tier tech and switched as much of their stuff to be reliant on B-tier tech as possible. Pretty soon the population growth would slow greatly as they no longer had the automation to pick up the slack, and they would be stuck at B-tier until the global population grew high enough to once again produce C-tier tech. Overall, it wasn't until 2540, nearly 300 years later, that the global population had grown to a point where they could start supporting the production of C-tier tech. And again, now that it is 2576, it is up to the countries of Lost Colony to decide what they do next. That is the end of this narration. I hope you enjoyed.